Hello there everyone, and welcome back to the channel Russia in Context. This is the Russian Week in Review. I apologize for the slight delay since the last video. However, there have been a just absolute massive ton of news stories, so no time to waste. Let's get right into it. So on January 24th, the Russian government passed legislation which gives them the legal authority to confiscate any property that they want. Now, I realize that this sounds like hyperbole, but based on the law that they passed, which is lacking clarity in key issues, this appears to be the case. Now, ostensibly, the law is designed to punish foreign agents, terrorists, and extremists, as well as those who publish fakes or discredit the military or government. But the way that it is written kind of includes any people whose actions are aimed at harming the security of the country, which is a phrase that is, so ill-defined, maybe on purpose, so that it could theoretically be applicable however the state sees fit. Now, the law of confiscation can be applied to any property: real estate, cars, patents, trademarks, whole businesses, even bank accounts. Really, regardless of whether or not it's co-owned by a spouse, that's not important. Also, it doesn't matter if the real estate is the only residence. It's fair game, so onto the street you go. Most importantly, there's no text stating that this law cannot be applied retroactively, meaning that the justice system here, could go look at prior cases and actions and potentially reopen them for new charges and new seizures. Now, the government has said that all seized assets will be used for war efforts, but again, we'll have to wait and see. For those hearing this that scoff at this, people who want to wave this issue away, who want to say that the Russian government will only go after foreign agents and those like them, well, Nezavisimaya Gazeta summed up the issue perfectly, in my opinion. Formally, confiscation will remain a means of compensation for crimes, though factually, it will become the main punishment for opponents and critics of the state. However, in Russia, it has happened more than once that the steamroller has caught up to those who started it. Just a quick aside. So what I mean when I say spreading fakes or discrediting the military, or I suppose more accurately, what the Russian government means is that spreading fakes would be sharing material that appears to show facts and events in a light which runs counter to the Kremlin's narrative. So basically, if you are, like a news channel or a large public figure, and you put out a story, or maybe even if you just share a story from CNN or BBC or something like that, and it says something that doesn't quite sync up with what is being shown on the news here, then theoretically you could get charged with spreading fakes. And with regards to discrediting, well, discrediting is basically just expressing a negative opinion about the army or the government. So just kind of stay quiet and don't say anything that's not hurrah, hurrah, yay, yay, yay. Another aside connected to this law, just to kind of put things into context, I mentioned that the law would target foreign agents and terrorists and extremists, and we have some statistics, and also fakes and discrediting. We have some statistics which kind of give us an idea of how many people this might actually affect. So there were 430 extremism cases in 2023, which is an increase of 62% from the year before. And then there were 273 cases of fakes and 81 cases of discrediting since March 2022. So in the last basically 2 years, there have been almost 800 cases for individuals and businesses. And in theory, based on this new law, all of those organizations and individuals can have their property of basically everything taken away from them if the government sees fit. So next up, we have another news story which is connected to court system and extremism cases. It is centered in the Russian Republic of Bashkortostan, sometimes known as Bashkiria. In it, political, ethnic, and eco-activist Fail Alstinov received a 4-year jail sentence, which led to widespread protests. Now, Fail is Bashkir, which is an ethnic minority in Russia. He was involved in fighting against Russian nationalism, and he was just for Bashkir political activism, and he wanted greater autonomy for the Bashkir people and the republic, including things like requiring quotas for how many Bashkir people are in local government offices. His eco-activism largely centered on Shikhans, which were these low, isolated mountain peaks in Bashkir, which are considered sacred to the people. Now, Alsinov wanted to protect the 3 remaining ones in Bashkiristan. And then in December of 2022, he was fined for speaking out against the war mobilization. He said that it did not adhere to the interest of the Bashkir people, something which, in addition to his prior political and eco-activism, likely put him in the government's crosshairs. The things came to a head in April of 2023 when Alsinov was protesting gold mining in the Baymak region of Bashkiristan when he supposedly used the terms Kara Khalq, which in Bashkir, I guess, means black people. He was talking about the migrant workers, which are Armenians, people from the Caucasus regions of Russia and Central Asia. Now, Alsinov says that he meant those words in the sense of chornorabochi, which is a term that kind of means, I guess, like flunky or a low-level unskilled worker. Now, he was arrested for incitement of ethnic hatred because of these words, which is kind of clearly absurd. But more importantly, it kind of opens up this question of why calling someone black would be considered an offensive term designed to incite hatred. But that conversation of racism and linguistics in the Russian language, we'll just have to wait for another time for that one. Fail Alsinov, now he's a terrorist and extremist. He's going to go to jail for 4 years for this action. And as a result of this, protests broke out in support of Alsinov. In the town of Baymak, where the court case was happening, there were thousands of people out there. They had to call in the police, and the police broke the crowd up. Now, I don't know the exact numbers. I don't have them written down right here in front of me. But from what I remember, from that first day, the day of his sentencing, something like, I think 50 people were detained and charged. But what's interesting is the next day, the protests moved to the capital city of Bashkiristan, which is Ufa. Now, this whole region is near the Ural Mountains. It's on the west side of the Ural Mountains, but it's still a Ural area. So it's kind of far from Moscow, but not super far. Anyway, the protests began again there. Now, granted, the protests in Ufa were much smaller, but the police still came, and there were probably like a few hundred people there. The police still came and told the people to leave. However, the people were protesting near the kind of largest monument in Ufa, and they just said that they were visiting the monument and that they had every right to be there. Realistically, in the end, I think between Baymak and Ufa, the total number of protesters that were detained and arrested were somewhere around, the number was somewhere around 100. But what's interesting is that in the past, when protesters were arrested, for example, here in Moscow, a lot of times got hit with very serious court cases. Sometimes they were sent away to prison for multiple years, whereas the protesters who were detained in Ufa and Baymak, I think, are mostly looking at fines and maybe some hours of community service. So for whatever reason, the local government has decided not to press hard, and that kind of opens up another reason why these protests are. This opens up a door as to why we're talking about these protests in the first place. Russia has a number of regions. In fact, a lot of regions which are kind of like these ethnic minority states. Bashkiria is one of them. And if you remember a few months back, last year in the autumn, there was a whole situation with Dagestan where a group of people stormed an airport in search of Jews on an airplane, which did not exist there, right? They stormed the building, they did some damage. And just, I believe, on the 24th of January here in Russia as well, in the far, far east in Yakutia, there was also a group of local ethnic citizens who also gathered together to protest decisions of the local government. Now, again, Why are we talking about this? Well, because it's kind of interesting. When things were happening about a year and a half ago, it seemed like the protest situation here in Russia was just done and finished, that anybody who might have been connected to the protest movement, they fled the country, either for moral issues or because they were worried about being drafted or what have you. However, as we're seeing with these further, more remote and more ethnic enclaves, I suppose we can call them, what we see is that the protest potential has not disappeared, and in fact, what we have here is a much different type of protest potential. That protest potential is in these national republics, these areas that are still largely Russian majority population. However, there are still sizable percentages of the ethnic populations there, and there are still sort of nationalist movements budding and growing there. What I think is most interesting is that the Kremlin and Moscow, the sort of powers here, have largely tried to ignore this situation. I don't know if this has to do with the fact that the presidential season is upon us here, the campaign and whatnot, and they just want to ignore any unpleasantness. What I have seen in the news is they're just sort of writing all of this off as the result of Western, I guess, foreign agents or I don't know. Everything is the West's fault, right? It's all Biden. Biden's to blame for everything here, or the CIA or whoever. It's never whatever the source of the root problem actually is. And by ignoring these issues, it's just kicking the can further down the road. So this is definitely something that we're going to probably be seeing more of in the future, but it just, again, remains to be seen. However, it is something to keep an eye on and something to keep in mind. One other thing I want to mention with regards to Alsinov is the fact that obviously he was the head of his family, and there was a organization that was gathering donations for his wife and his children because he's going off to prison for 4 years. And then because he's charged with extremism, they had to close that fundraising down because people who donated money to that could theoretically be then charged with funding extremism, which would then theoretically also place them against the law, and that law of confiscation could, again, then theoretically be applied to them. Real fun legislative quagmire we're getting into here. So on the 25th, Friday of January, another sentence was handed down from the legal system here, and it was connected to Igor Girkin, who is better known by his nickname Strelkov. He will be getting 4 years and 11 months for extremism, surprise, surprise, for a post of his in Telegram. Now, Strelkov is a former FSB officer and an Army veteran, and he's perhaps best known in the West for being a key player in the annexation of Crimea and starting the war in Donbass. He himself took responsibility for starting the conflict with a group of Russian militants. He was also found guilty in absentia by a Dutch court and held responsible for the downing of flight MH17 over eastern Ukraine in 2014. In more recent years, he has gained popularity in Russia by blogging about the war on Telegram and YouTube, often being quite vocal and critical of the Kremlin's moves, which he saw as not being drastic enough. In April 2023, he formed the Club of Angry Patriots, an ultra-pro-war group which was tolerated up until Prigozhin's March for Justice on Moscow, which was in June of 2023, after which time such dissidence was rooted out, and Girkin was arrested on July 21st of 2023. So he has been in detention for 6 months now before he got his sentence. Andrei Gurylev, a United Russia deputy in the Gosduma, is once again agitating for repression and a gulag-style system. Now, such rhetoric is pretty common from him. It's kind of become an almost bi-weekly type thing where he goes on and he says just some really atrocious stuff that like the vast majority of people would never ever agree with. It's kind of interesting too because it's getting to the point where even people within his own party seem to just kind of be ignoring him. However, that said, the fact that no one in the government has come out and actively said that, like, hey, forced work, prison / death camps kind of were a bad thing in our past, and maybe you should drop that rhetoric. The fact that nobody has done that is also kind of telling of just the, general disdain for certain things, certain conversations to be had. Boris Nadezhdin managed to gather his 100,000 signatures that he needed to have in order for his name to be on election ballots. Now, I'm going to go into more depth on Nadezhdin in another video, as long with the other presidential candidates, once the actual list of them is all finalized. But it's important to note that he is being presented as kind of the anti-war candidate. He is going to be what a lot of people are calling the protest vote. Now, does he have a chance of actually winning the presidency? No way in hell. Is it possible that he won't be allowed on the ballot? Also completely possible. However, there is a lot of talk and chatter going on right now about if he is allowed to be put on the ballot, it will be used theoretically as a way. It will be used by the Kremlin as a way to demonstrate just how low support for peace talks actually is, right? Like if the only anti-war candidate gets, say, 3% of the vote, then they'll just show that, yeah, of course, nobody actually wants the war to end. Everybody just likes the way things are going right now. So we're just going to keep doing things the way we're doing them. Again, we don't know for sure if he will actually be allowed to be on the ballot. There are certain things that the Central Election Committee could do to prevent him from being on the ballot. But we'll, again, probably circle back around to this topic in the next week or so. We got to talk about airplanes. It has not been a good time for airplanes in Russia in the last period. The first thing that I can think of would be 2 military planes which were hit over the Sea of Azov. The Russian government did not say anything or give any confirmation about them for some time, and then it kind of became understood that one of them was heavily damaged and the other one was lost. It's still unclear. No official explanation has been given whether it was Ukrainian forces that attacked the planes over the Sea of Azov, or whether, again, Russia's own anti-aircraft devices accidentally struck them down. We don't know, probably never will. When we look at the domestic sector for aviation here in Russia, one of the big news stories was S7, which is the largest privately owned airline here in Russia. They had to lay off 15% of their employees because they have grounded 20% of their airplane park. Now, the reason that the park was grounded has to do with an inability to get the aerobuses serviced, right? The engines, they just can't do anything with them, and they can't get them repaired, and obviously there are sanctions on parts. This is not just a problem of S7, however. In fact, we've seen a number of issues in the last week where there was an A320 or 321, which had to, coming into landing here in Moscow, had to circle around once again because its navigational computer went on the fritz. And then there was a flight on the way, I don't know where from, but they had to land early in Novosibirsk because their hydraulic system went out, and that was also an A320 or an A321. Likewise, there have been a number of other small flights. There was a Bombardier, which had some issues on the flight from Yamal to, I believe, Novosibirsk, which also had to land early for technical reasons. And then one of the other big flight incidents recently was a private airplane crashed in northern Afghanistan. Now, it was a Russian airplane, and it was carrying an all-Russian crew and 2 Russian citizens who were flying back to Russia for medical reasons. It's still unclear why the plane crashed. However, the main theory seems to be that both engines stopped working. That they both just stopped working. Now, if that's true, and considering all the other stuff I just mentioned, this just sort of all points to this idea that sanctions are having an effect on the industry. But we're going to come back to that, aviation industry here in Russia just a little bit later. However, I do have to mention that on the 24th, near the Russian-Ukrainian border, and Il-76 was shot out of the sky. It was likely carrying a bunch of Ukrainian POWs, and it was likely shot out of the sky by Ukrainian anti-air defenses. However, and this is where things get a little foggy, people are beginning to have their doubts. Now, the reason this is not like an open and shut case is because there was no list of names of who was supposed to be exchanged. When they finally released a list, it was not from an official source. And when they cross-referenced the list, some of the names were theoretically of prisoners who had been freed before. Also, there are no pictures of any bodies in the fields or anything like that. Not that people necessarily need to see that. However, typically when there is a disaster of this magnitude, those images, especially here in Russia, especially on Telegram channels, that gets leaked out purposefully or just because. So because there have been no images of corpses, because there has been such a weird reaction from the Russian government because they haven't released the name of the POWs who were supposed to be traded, people are beginning to feel like something's fishy. Now, again, this feels a lot like conspiracy theory, so this is not something that I myself believe. I'm actually here in this situation inclined to believe the official narrative. However, as with most things, this lack of transparency is not good, and if the Russian government wants to, make this conspiracy theory to quash it before it gets out of hand or before it begins to gain traction, then maybe they could just, again, release the official document from an official source with the names of the POWs who were on the plane, if that's the case, and also, I guess, release more footage or more evidence from the crash site. Anyway, had to mention it. It happened while I was gathering the information for this video, and although it's not quite what I would consider sort of Russia news, it kind of is, and it's also connected to planes crashing, which is kind of weird. It's kind of gotten to be such just a usual occurrence here that, as weird as it sounds, when the plane crashed the other day, it was just kind of another one. So, yeah. I guess you can adapt to anything. Anyway, moving on from plane crashes, but it's going to be kind of the same as plane crashes. We have to mention some drone attacks here. Over the last week and a half or so, there have been a number of large drone attacks, and they've almost exclusively been on fuel depots. If they didn't make it to the fuel depot, I know there have been a few that have hit some residential buildings, but I think they were all on the way to fuel depots. But on the 21st, near St. Petersburg, a Novatech oil terminal got hit. It was seriously damaged, and I think the total export potential was cut in half. They managed to put out the fire after a day or so, and the situation is kind of resolved, although it is going to take them months to get everything repaired. In addition to that, in the city of Tuapse, which is in the south of Russia, early in the morning of the 25th, there was a drone attack on some fuel cisterns as well, another fuel processing plant. And then a little bit earlier still, on the 19th, in the Bryanskskaya Oblast, there was also an attack. And since all these attacks have been on fuel depots, let's transition into talk about oil here in Russia. We got some statistics released this last week as well as to how much oil is helping the Russian economy. And the answer is basically not at all. Last year, oil accounted for 0% of the GDP growth. This is probably partly due to increased global supply, a decrease in prices, but also the price cap to some degree as well. In general, the Russian economy last year grew thanks to the service sector, which is, alive and well, all things considered, but mostly the military-industrial complex, right? However, all of this is bad news, especially the oil news. This is bad for the Fond Nacionalное Благосостояние, the FNB. This is basically Russia's rainy day fund. Over the last decade or so, the Russian government has been taking extra profits from oil revenues and putting them away into this fund. And the idea was that this money would be available for future generations, in the future when oil profits dry up, or basically just putting it away for the future, right? Russia was making a lot of money 10 years ago. They were living large, and it was just sort of like, we'll put this away, and then when the oil situation dries up, we'll still be able to live well, and we'll still be able to ensure our children or our grandchildren a nice, solid future, economically speaking. Bit of a problem, though. Well, there's two pieces of bad news with regards to the fund. First of all, the oil money does not seem to be flowing into it anymore. Second of all, the government has already started dipping into it and taking away from the future quite a bit, it seems. So last year, the Russian government used the fund, money from the fund, to cover the budget deficit, which was, I believe, around 3 trillion rubles, if I remember correctly. Not a small sum, let's be real. In fact, by some estimates, something like a third to a half of the liquid assets of the fund have already been used. This is where we come back around to airplanes, specifically civilian airplanes, right? Now, Russia currently has a problem with airplanes. Western airplanes are slowly falling apart. That's just a fact. Nobody is denying that. Anybody who says otherwise, I don't know what reality they're living in, but read the experts, listen to the experts, they're all saying it, right? Airlines have grounded planes so they can cannibalize them for parts. It's just the situation. So what the Russian government has suggested is that over the next 6 years, they would build 600 Russian airplanes. Now, ignoring the fact that Russia hasn't really produced any airplanes of any number in decades, which presents its own problems of just getting the whole system started again, they don't have any money to do that. So what the Russian government has proposed is that they would dip in to the fund once again to take money to pay for the project. Now, I believe the total was something like 250 billion rubles. Again, a not small amount. However, the problem here also is the situation that the government, the agency responsible for constructing these airplanes and taking care of this whole question, has almost never, as far as I know, completed a government project on time. So that 6 years almost certainly would be 10 or 15. And I don't think they've ever done it without going 2 or 3 times over budget. So the rainy day fund for Russia's future, I guess we might get some airplanes out of it at some point in time here. We'll see. Had to switch hands with the microphone there. I was getting a little bit tired. So January 21st marked the 100th anniversary of the death of Lenin, not the Beatle, the revolutionary here in Russia. And communists, the Communist Party obviously went and they had the little march and they went to Red Square and they went to his mausoleum and they laid flowers on it. For those of you who don't know, the embalmed, mummified body of Lenin is lying on Red Square. You can still go visit it. However, the whole date, the anniversary, opened up a lot of discussion as to why do we have a dead guy laying like right in the middle of the city. And they did some surveys, and they asked people if they think Lenin should be buried. Most are in favor of burying him. However, the majority of respondents who are in favor of burying him also kind of went with the caveat that they should wait until that last generation of diehard Soviet citizens for whom Lenin actually meant something. Once they have passed away, then they'll feel a little bit more calm about, putting him into the ground. Realistically, they should. It costs the country millions of dollars every year to keep him embalmed and keep him available to the public, and it's also really weird. I mean, it's kind of cool. Don't get me wrong. I've been there twice. But yeah, kind of weird. However, it's kind of starting to feel like they're never going to bury him. They bring it up, this question, once every, 5 years or so, and then they make a bunch of noise about it, and then they just drop it. And honestly, the whole cult of personality here in Russia is alive and well. I mean, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if Lenin is ever removed from Red Square. Who knows? Maybe in the future there will be more mausoleums on Red Square for other, famous Russians. We'll see. Cults of personality, they're a tenacious group. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is that Russian citizenship is becoming less valuable. And I know that's a weird thing to say. I know a lot of people might say that it's really not worth anything to begin with. But let me kind of clarify what I mean by this. So not long ago, the government passed a law which allows them to rescind citizenship of citizens who were naturalized, meaning citizens who are not citizens from birth. Now, they would only do this to naturalized citizens who commit kind of serious crimes, murder, like the bad ones, right? Like the sort of heavy crimes as they're categorized here in Russia. However, as I understand, based on text and whatnot, again, I'm not a legal scholar, so maybe I'm wrong here, but in the Russian Constitution, it says that all citizens are equal before the law. All citizens. So theoretically, if you're a naturalized citizen or a citizen from birth, you have equal status before the law. Which means that this new law tells us one of two things. Either A, the Constitution guarantees nothing and that they can just sort of ignore it. The politicians can just ignore it and make laws however they want. A possibility. Or B, that citizens, not naturalized ones, citizens from birth, that they could theoretically also have their citizenship taken away if they break certain laws. And this is just like a fun, interesting concept to throw around, considering the fact that they just introduced a new law which allows them to confiscate property, which I'm also pretty sure is not it doesn't mesh well with the Constitution as it stands right now. So, yeah. Anyway, it's an interesting thing. And I do want to point out here, I do realize that in the United States, you can also lose your citizenship if you're naturalized, but that's really only if you lie during the naturalization process. So it's a little different. Regardless, yeah, the new laws here this last week have been pretty just not great. Not great at all. Something a little sillier, I suppose. Alexander Bigelov, the governor of St. Petersburg, he recently explained why the special military operation was started in the first place. And it turns out it was because of gender-neutral toilets. Now, I realize that his whole thing was that, he was trying to extrapolate into this culture war nonsense. However, it's just kind of funny because gender-neutral toilets exist everywhere. Every single household has one. Plenty of shopping centers have gender-neutral toilets. And it's also a weird thing to get upset about when a sizable percentage of the Russian population does not have indoor plumbing. I feel like they would probably be okay with an indoor toilet, even if it was gender-neutral. But I don't know. That's just me. I'm one of those crazy people who, I guess, thinks a toilet is a toilet, Just do your business and get out of there. How about a nice news story here? I think we're due for that. So this year, over 100 million Russian citizens will be able to have a free physical, a free checkup at the doctor's office, which is great. It's preventative healthcare is always a super, super fantastic thing. We need to see more of that. But it's not just that they get to see a doctor. They will also be able to visit a psychologist if they feel like they need that. And mental health is just as important as physical health. So, really good on the Russian government for at least kind of, keeping some of the basic necessities available to the public. So all thumbs up there. From the realm of medicine and medication to the realm of self-medication, I guess, let's talk about alcohol. And specifically beer, so nothing too serious, but, regardless, quite popular drink here in Russia still, nonetheless. First thing I want to mention is that there is a potential ban that the Russian government is considering with regards to foreign beer imports, which, okay, fine, right? Russia produces beer as well, too. It's of mixed quality. Some of it's good, some of it's like whatever, but that's aside from the point. The ban of imported beer is very interesting when we look at a court ruling from St. Petersburg just this last week. Now, the court in St. Petersburg made it clear that despite Carlsberg adamantly being against it, the Russian-owned Baltica breweries will still be able to use the Carlsberg name for beers here inside of Russia. So Carlsberg, the company, has left. They don't want to, have their beers in Russia anymore. But the Russian legal system has said, that's okay. You can use the intellectual property and continue to sell Carlsberg beer here. So in theory, with this, I guess, now legal precedent, any company could just start producing their own version of a Western brand that is no longer here, right? Like, so for example, any of those Russian or any of those foreign European beers, right? A Russian company could just come in and start making their version of them, right? So there could be, I don't know, I'm really horrible with beer names, so whatever. But theoretically, designer brands, right? Gucci is no longer officially here in Russia, so theoretically they could just open a new Gucci chain of production and continue using that. Again, at least that's the precedent that I'm seeing being set by this decision. We'll have to see, but I do feel that if people kind of are paying attention to this, it won't be long before other business people begin to try and flood the market with knockoffs, ultimately. Time for some really not so great news in the realm of demographics. 2023 was the second lowest year for total number of births in Russian history, and there was a natural loss to the population of about 500,000 people. Based on some current predictions, right, these numbers are not great, and some demographic researchers have said that in about 40 years, around 2065, the Russian population might be all of 90 million people, and half of those 90 million will be either retired or approaching that age. So demographically, just a not a great situation. All right, we're going to talk for a second about LGBT, well, specifically LGBT, so I'm going to have to put this little thing here at the bottom, so just live with this text here for a little bit. But basically, there was a ruling by the Russian Supreme Court, right, that LGBTQ was this sort of extremist terrorist organization. And we got some insight into their decision-making process. Now, basically, according to them, the use of feminine versions of words is a sign of the devious influence of LGBTQ, of this, I guess, international organization, which I think is kind of odd because I guess it means that they themselves don't understand how the Russian language works. See, Russian language has genders. in the language itself. There's the male words, there's the female words, there are the gender neutral words, and then there are the plural words, right? That's kind of in English, obviously, we don't have male and female nouns. We just have nouns. So it's kind of it's really kind of strange that the Russian government would decide that female versions of words are a sign of LGBTQ influence. I realize that what they're saying is it has to do with recent additions to the language, right? For example, an old example, there's the word for a boy student, which is student, and then there's the word for a girl student, which is studentka, right? They had ka to the end of the word, makes it feminine. The examples that they gave for these new feminine nouns are more modern ones. However, right, that's just how languages work, right? As women move into professions, or as professions just simply become less male-dominated, then, right, it would be natural for a language with male and feminine nouns to adapt male nouns to become feminine. That just happens. And I think it's kind of weird that the Russian Supreme Court is like using this. I know, again, they're using this in like the sort of Western culture war sense, that the Russian language is being corrupted by the West, and the West is to blame by taking good masculine words and making them feminine. But yeah, that's just not how language works. Language changes, and they're attempting to just twist this fact to their own, I guess, the way that they want things to appear. Ultimately, languages change and evolve. They are not twisted and manipulated by some secret gay cabal, let alone a secret gay linguistic cabal, right? That's just absurd. But we're not done there. We got a little bit more insight too, and what we saw in the text of, again, their whole deliberation was that the international LGBT social movement, which came into existence in the USA in the 1960s as part of the politics of restricting birth rates alongside other approvals of like non-traditional family structures, has existed in Russia since 1984. 1984, that's wild, because if you know anything about the sort of LGBT movement in the United States, you would probably understand that at that point in time in the States, there was no LGBT movement, right? Lesbians and gays were not huge fans of bisexuals or transgenders. But evidently, according to the Russian Supreme Court, that's actually false. That they weren't hella unorganized, that they were, in fact, super organized, and that they had somehow infiltrated the Soviet Union and were corrupting I don't know. I really don't know. It is... this is like some InfoWars level nonsense. So, pretty wild stuff. Some fun reading there. But yeah, I don't recommend you dig into it. It's a trip. We are starting to get some insight into just how much of the utility structure in Russia is rotten completely through. In some situations, in some areas, it's something around like 60% of the total infrastructure is going to need to be changed out. The government is still deciding how best to move forward to make sure what happened at the beginning of January does not happen again in the future. I have to mention the fact that it is like 3.5 weeks into January, and some of the outages from the beginning of the year are still not fixed. There are new ruptures happening every day. Streets are being flooded, things like that. And I do want to point out, right, one of the ministries here in Russia pointed out or released a statement that said the total number of accidents in utilities infrastructure this year is the same as it was last year. And you know what? That's possibly true. However, what they didn't maybe take into account is the size of accidents can be substantially different. And I feel like that might be the case here. You can have a lot of small accidents that don't really catch anybody's attention, But when you have a few really big accidents or a lot of really big accidents, it's a little bit of a different situation. So I don't know. We'll see. It has been around freezing, at least in the Moscow region, and kind of European Russia. The temperatures have come back up. So the situation is not as dire as it was a few weeks ago. But the situation still remains. One, I guess, positive aspect of this whole infrastructure collapse from a few weeks ago is that when it was snowing earlier this week, I noticed that they were really proactive in getting out there and cleaning the snow, almost as though the city government wants to show people that in terms of infrastructure and utilities and making sure everything is clean and in working order, that they want, they want to show everybody that they can do the job. So I don't know, it might be completely unrelated, but it was a very odd coincidence considering the fact that through all of December, they seemed to not care less, or that they couldn't care less when it came to snow removal. And then after this last fiasco, they suddenly got their act together real fast. So I don't know. I guess, look on the bright side, right? I have to mention Krishchenia. I made a YouTube short about this last year. I guess I can link that here or wherever. Krishchenia is just a Christian holiday. It's like a baptism, the Epiphany, and they walk into the cut rivers, the cut bodies of water. They dunk themselves in the cold, cold water, and then they come out kind of blessed. Cool tradition. Nothing to be said about it more than that. Very awesome. I've never partaken in it. I am not that bold, although I probably should get my act together and do it one of these days, right? Right? You all agree with me. And we're on to the last story. It's not really a positive one, but I did not organize anything this week, as you probably could tell. We'll talk about that in just a second, but I want to get through this last news story real quick. So it has to do with a cat named Twix. Like I said, it's not like the happiest story. On a long-distance train ride, Twix the cat got out of its compartment and was wandering around the wagon. The woman in charge of the wagon, the train car, saw the cat and at the next train stop, removed him from the cabin. It was in the middle of the countryside. It was very cold outside, below freezing temperatures. And by the time the owner of the cat realized that the cat was missing, it was too late. People banded together and went out searching for the cat. They eventually found the cat. It was frozen to death. So Twix the cat, rest in peace, up there with Harambe. But things got interesting. People were livid. People were just going crazy. They wanted the woman to be fired. They wanted a criminal investigation to be opened. People lost their damn minds over this cat Twix that they had just heard about, which, again, kind of makes sense. There aren't a lot of protest options. We talked about the ethnic minorities in their various little national territories. However, for most Russians, you really can't scream and get angry at the government because laws and very serious ones. So getting very pissed and just expressing your rage through the internet at the system due to the death of a cat, that's totally chill. You can do that. So a lot of people were blowing off some steam, I think, when it comes to the cat. Or I guess Russians just really, really, really love cats. Regardless, the woman who killed Twix the cat, I'm sure she feels horrible. But it's not such a simple situation because, as it turns out, Twix the cat got out of its compartment on the train, and then the woman, before she put Twix off the train, went around and asked everyone on the train if they knew whose cat it was, including, I guess, the owners of the cat who didn't recognize their own cat. So, yeah, I mean, obviously I feel bad for Twix the cat, but you don't recognize your own cat when somebody comes around asking if somebody lost a cat, and you don't have your cat. Like, just, it's a weird situation. Again, RIP Twix. But anyway, we made it through the news for this week. I know this was a very disorganized, hastily thrown together, just mishmash of segments. Part of the reason is that there just were so many stories this week. As I started putting everything together and I started looking at all of the, again, my whole goal of this is to try to highlight news stories, some of which you probably will get in the West. I know some of these news stories were available on like CNN and BBC and whatnot. However, a lot of the stuff, maybe especially stuff in the second half, not so much, right? And the whole goal of this is to sort of highlight some of the nonsensical elements of the news cycles here in Russia, and also just some of the economic things or little insights that you probably wouldn't get elsewhere. That ends up just being a mass of news stories for me to sort through and try to cobble together in some sort of fashion so that you can maybe understand things kind of how I understand them here. In the future, I do plan on doing things a little bit more scripted. Again, a lot of this was just unscripted. I have basic notes that I'm going off of, and that's the way it is. So, I don't know. If this has been more enjoyable, please, for the love of God, let me know. I mean, like, we're probably 30 minutes into this video. Let's be completely honest, and I am rambling at this point. However, I hope there's something endearing to that. I hope so. Probably not, but let's hope. And if this format of more kind of off-the-cuff commentary is preferable to the cut and dried by the script former videos, then let me know. I'll try to find a happy medium there. Regardless, I hope this has been informative. I hope you've learned something. If you have questions, again, please leave them in the comments. I'm sure some of what I said could be clarified further. Each of these subjects realistically could probably have their own 10-minute video, but I'm one man doing this by himself, attempting to throw this all together in some sort of cohesive and coherent format for all of you out there. So, yeah, if you have questions, leave them below in the comments. I will respond to them as thoroughly as humanly possible. And if there is some major misunderstanding or serious questions, I can even do a quick follow-up video. Whatever you want, right? Just let me know. That being said, as always, hit the like button, share this video with people who might also find it informative. And yeah, once again, I hope you've enjoyed the Russian Week in Review. This has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.